Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me all the way to the back with this mic? Cool. I see some thumbs up. Awesome. So my name is Rose, and I am going to be speaking on GRC, a Swiss Army knife. This talk is one that I've been mulling over doing for years. GRC is super near and dear to my heart. It just makes me insanely happy to do anything GRC related and kind of send the information out into the world. So we're going to talk about this topic. I promise I didn't make it boring. GRC is super interesting, especially if you work in it. This talk is meant to be very generic, so if you have other departments in your organization that are struggling working with other business units, a lot of the information that I talk today can be universally applied. So take these takeaways and go apply them within your organization. So I picked a Swiss Army knife as the concept of this talk because a Swiss Army knife is so multifaceted. You can use it to screw, you have a knife, you have clippers, you could pretty much make it whatever you need to be. So use this concept in order to talk about GRC, and hopefully it resonates with you guys. Well, before we get into the good parts of this presentation, a little bit about me. So I am the Director of IT and Compliance at Spring Health. Spring Health is a mental health company that specializes in data and analytics to bring really good care to patients. So taking away from doing kind of like hitting the darts on the wall approach to mental health, but rather using data and analytics to provide really good care to our patients. As you can imagine, we have a pretty robust platform and lots of security things that need to happen on that. Before I came to Spring, I was a consultant for years at CISO. I see some of my CISO friends in the crowd, so hi, CISO. If you guys have not worked with them, go see Joe. He will hook you up and get you any support that you need. So shameless plug for you, Joe. And before that, I was in the military for quite a bit of time, 8 years, and I did network engineering, I did IT, I worked on crypto gear, you name it, I was doing it. And so my background gives me a whole lot of different things to pull from when I'm trying to build really good business relationships and fix the things that I'm trying to fix within my organization. Additionally, I have some education. You guys can see it up there. More importantly, I like to volunteer in the community. I do lots of mentoring with women in cybersecurity, lots of work with giving back to the InfoSec community, such as speaking. And then additionally, I run the diversity and tech group at my organization, trying to bring more diverse folks into our technology department, which includes engineering, security, and whatnot. So enough about me. You guys didn't come to this presentation to learn about Rose. You came to learn about GRC. So we will get into our topics. Today we are going to level set on what exactly is GRC. I've mentioned that tons of times now and haven't quite gone over what that really means to everybody. So we'll level set on GRC, what we normally do in this department. We'll talk about the challenges of GRC. So these challenges are ultra important when you're trying to figure out how to fix your department, how to make it more efficient, how to enable the business. Then we'll talk about relationships in the organization. So anytime that we are working with anybody in the business, we need to understand the dynamics of those relationships in order to maybe fix the things that are going on, ask for help, whatever we need. So we're going to talk about relationships. And then we're going to get into the pronged approach. So what do I mean by the Swiss Army knife? And we'll break it down by some different prongs. And we'll have some takeaways. The goal of this presentation is that you can go back to your organization and implement some of these tidbits and try to improve the quality of life when working with GRC, working with the business. Governance, risk, and compliance. That is what GRC stands for. A lot of organizations have a GRC department. Maybe it's called security and compliance, maybe just compliance, but ultimately it is a governance, risk, and compliance type functionality. So we have 3 pillars that are happening within this department. We have governance, which is where you're aligning processes and actions, you're developing documentation, policies, procedures, standards that are generally governing the things that need to happen within the organization. Then you have risk management. So risk management includes risks that you maybe find on your platforms, in the environment, processes, but it also includes vendor risk management. So how are you managing the life cycle of those vendors? Additionally, you can also lump in client questionnaires into the risk management area. I know I refer to this program as client assurance and security. So anytime you have a client sending you a questionnaire, asking you about documentation, asking for artifacts, whatever it may be. Then we have compliance. So compliance is how we are complying with the legal regulatory landscape of our particular business. So I'll give the example of Spring Health. Spring Health is a mental health company, so HIPAA is applicable to us, the HIPAA privacy rule, security rule, breach notification. So compliance team is responsible for understanding, consuming, and ensuring that we are complying with that. Additionally, we have EU citizens, so GDPR becomes in scope for our compliance team, and we have consumers out in California for CCPA. So these three pillars make up the governance, risk, and compliance department, and as you guys likely know, it's very large, the activities that need to happen in this department, and we touch every single business unit in order to be able to fulfill these things that we need to do. Each of these pillars have their own nuanced processes that need to happen, and they're ran by a team that's normally relatively small. I'm fortunate enough to have 4 people plus myself at Spring Health for a compliance department, but in the past, maybe it was just me running it, or maybe we had to get staff aug, and so it becomes very consuming to try to get all of these things in place. Now, since we level set on challenges, or what the pillars are, let's talk about the challenges. So before you even get to the point that you can start enabling the business to work better, work faster, and to be less of a blocker, you have to understand the challenges. And so I give some examples up on the screen. Please make sure that you go back to your own organization and you observe what the challenges are within your organization, because that is ultimately how you'll identify what are the things that you need to solve. And so some of the challenges that are listed here is we have where a compliance department may only be focused on the regulatory landscape. For this, if you are only focused on the regulatory landscape, your department will turn into a checkbox activity. And that checkbox activity ultimately influences how other departments see you. Well, compliance is asking us to do security awareness again. Let me just get it done. Let me just check off the box. That's not what we want happening. We want to have really good partnerships with the business. So you want to get away from focusing on just the regulatory things and focus on how do I enable the business to work better. Additionally, cross-functional collaboration tends to be difficult when you are working in GRC. So we'll talk about some tips and tricks to improve that. As you guys likely know, while GRC has some of the processes that we have to implement in order to satisfy legal regulatory things, a lot of times we have to rely on our counterparts outside of these groups, like engineering, product, maybe even people operations or HR. And so achieving the point where you have really good cross collaboration can be challenging. And so you have to figure out, how do I make this happen? The biggest challenge that I've also seen is being reactive versus proactive. So if your compliance department is in a perpetual state of like, all right, we got to get this done, we got to get this done, well, now you are creating undue burden to other teams that then need to hit those items. And so you need to get to the point where you're being proactive. Can you put a schedule out? Can you have notifications well in advance and reminders and sort of things like that where you become more proactive? Then there is a lack of alignment between the business and GRC. So the business and GRC, we have to be speaking the same language. If not, we're always going to be butting heads, right? So the alignment needs to happen there, and it needs to happen in a way where we are enabling the business to work faster, harder, stronger, and not blocking them. And it's challenging. If you work in GRC, you already know it's a very challenging aspect, obviously why it's listed here on GRC challenges. And then another challenge is too many manual processes. So we are just now getting to the point where we can start automating within the governance risk compliance space. We're getting tools that allow us to automate vendor reviews, access reviews, maybe even SOC 2 controls, like tools like Drata, and I think Vanta is another one. So we're finally getting to the point that we can move away from manual processes, but the manual processes, they cause a lot of overhead, they become really clunky, and they're hard for people to understand what they actually need to do at the organization. This all creates all of these different challenges within this department. Additionally, what I have not included on here are some things that I personally do to kind of track challenges within my own organization. So if you guys maybe don't know what those are yet, you're trying to figure it out, I do it a couple different ways. I observe, so we use Slack. So if I'm in Slack and I'm starting to see people like, oh, this process is so long, or they're fussing, okay, well, that's starting to give me indicators that people maybe need training, they need support, whatever. I talk to my team, both in a public forum and private, so one-on-ones. Guys, what are the challenges that you guys are seeing? Are you having issues with working with different parts of the department? Because that tells me, as a leader, I need to go partner with my peers and figure out a good approach to ironing out these issues. And then in the public forum, when we meet as a team, I like to ask because it creates a collaborative nature where we can partner together as a group and figure out the best approach to solving these challenges that we face. With challenges, that kind of gives you an ineffective GRC program. So when you have an ineffective GRC program, that becomes very noticeable to the business. It becomes noticeable when they're trying to push a product to go live, and we can't let them because they found out about a risk the day before they were trying to go live. It's ineffective when people are trying to onboard a vendor, and it's taking them a month and a half to even get them through the vendor review. And we want to reduce these things. We don't want the business to be slowed down. Again, the whole point of this conversation is that we're enabling the business. We're enabling them and being a good partner. And we can't do that if we have an ineffective program. So, ineffective program, you may have unnecessary program complexity. Maybe you have a vendor risk management program that has 20 steps when maybe it only needs 6. So it really takes looking at your program, evaluating what you're actually doing, and figuring out what are these things that I can get rid of that makes my program super clunky and hard to understand. Unknown service level agreements for processes. This is a big one, and a lot of frustrations when working with compliance. If someone comes to me and they say, hey, compliance team, we need you to fill out a client questionnaire, and it is 60 questions. I should be able to tell them immediately, all right, a 60-question questionnaire is going to take me 3 days. And I've done that because I've done the data and analytics on the back end to know how long does it normally take my team. I know when we do a vendor review, it's going to take at a maximum 3 weeks because we've done the data and analytics in the back end. And so when you're talking with the business, they need to understand the SLAs. If they're trying to roll out a project or a new product, they should know, all right, I need 3 weeks of compliance time built into this project plan. And so now you start to reduce the frustrations when they're working with us. But if you don't have that information and haven't planned for it, it gives the illusion that the team isn't operating effectively. It can create headaches when working with us. So highly recommend you understand your SLAs for these processes that interface with the business. Lack of visibility into risk. All day long we deal with risk, right? Regardless if you work in GRC or you work in security. And so when you have an ineffective program happening, you're getting lack of visibility into risk. I want the business to come to me. Every time they identify something that may be a risk, they self-identified, I want them to come to me. But if we have a clunky program, if they don't feel like they can trust us, that we're going to take action, they're not going to come to us with their risk. And so we start to lose visibility of the risk. Additionally, if they don't feel comfortable talking to us, they don't want to have the dialogue, well, then maybe we don't even get risk treated. And we have risk lingering out in the environment, which isn't what we want either. Additionally, when we are more in a reactive state, you have an increased budget or increased money due to overhead of employees or other things that you may need to do. So for each of my processes within governance, risk, and compliance, going back to these SLAs, I know it's going to take my team 3 weeks to review a vendor, and I know throughout the year we're going to have around 25 vendors. You start to get a sense of how many hours you need for your team throughout the year. You capacity plan. But if you don't have that and you turn into a more of a reactive nature, then you ultimately end up spending more money on things that you didn't plan for. And so again, it's an ineffective program happening. And then the final one, an ineffective GRC program, is your GRC team lacks the technology knowledge in order to be able to talk with the business. How can I tell you how to secure something or implement a control if I have no idea about the technologies? So when you have an ineffective team, they can't go to the business and say, hey, business, I need you to implement mobile device management, and these are the things that I need you to do. They don't understand the technologies. So if your team is working, I highly recommend that they understand their platform. They understand how the data flows in and out. They understand all these different technologies, because it truly does make an impact in how you're conversing with the business. So far we've talked about the GRC pillars. We've talked about some challenges and inefficiencies. I want to touch on relationships. So this is a quick snapshot and definitely not all-encompassing. The relationships that you have in the org, GRC and security touch every single department. Some may be more high touch than others, but you touch every single department. And so it's really critical that you are truly building rapport with these people in the department, because ultimately you're trying to get them to implement or do something that you need them to do, right? So you want to have relationships with these different groups, whether it's product and making sure that you get integrated into their life cycle before they push something out, whether it's engineering to make sure that repos aren't in a public area where other people can access it, to maybe your HR or people operations functions to make sure background checks are happening and making sure they're getting their questions answered about background checks or other processes. So really focus on these different relationships that you need to have, and focus on how your processes go into these different areas. So if I know that people operations are going to touch background checks, they should know that they're responsible over those different areas. The same way engineering should know that they're responsible for maintaining repos in a certain way. So it's super critical you understand your relationships and you build rapport with each of these groups, and you understand the pains and frustrations that they go through in their own areas, because they're all humans, right? We want to make sure that we're treating them with respect. We're not just demanding them to do things. And sometimes that gets away from us when we're working in compliance, when there's so many things that we have to ensure the business is doing in order to keep, data safe and secure, right? All right, so we talked all these different areas of GRC, and we haven't actually talked about a Swiss Army knife yet, even though it is in the title of this presentation. So what I have here is a pronged approach to GRC. So I'm going to tell you some of the things that have worked really well in my life with GRC, whether I learned it from the military, I learned it from consulting, being an individual contributor, or now in a leadership position. So we have these prongs up here. I picked 5. Your own GRC knife for your organization, maybe you have 6 prongs, maybe you have 7, maybe you have 2. It really depends on what you are trying to accomplish for your organization. So again, this is meant just to kind of get you going. I love this concept of the GRC knife because it truly can be anything that you want it to be. Whenever I was getting ready for this presentation, I definitely don't know a lot about GRC, or not GRC, Swiss Army knife, so maybe I shouldn't have gone with that. But I was truly shocked at all of the different Swiss Army knives out there. They're pink, they're red, they have all these different functionalities on them, and they truly can be anything that you want them to be. So when you're thinking about how to make your program more effective, think of all these different ways that you can approach it. Don't think of it just like, all right, this is my area, I'm only going to focus on these compliance controls. Think outside of the box. Think, how can I partner with the business? What do they need to be successful? How can I enable them to do the things that I ultimately need them to do? So we'll have these different prongs in order to be able to support them. The first prong that I have up here is communication. I cannot stress just how critical communication is within the organization. If you do not take anything else away from this talk, take the communication aspect and truly implement it at your organization. When we have things that need to get accomplished and maybe where there's misalignment, communication is often the root cause of why we're having issues in the organization, why we're butting heads, why there's frustrations. And so take a good look at the communication that's happening within your org. Advocating. So you should advocate for your business partners for the work that they need to get done. We shouldn't be bullying them into the work, but rather advocating and lifting them up. We're going to talk about training. We're going to talk about enabling the business. So what are some of the different things that we can do outside of these other prongs that enable our department to function better? And then we'll talk about automation. So how do we remove those manual processes that create inefficiencies and automate the processes where possible? So for communication, I thought it was important to cover a couple different aspects here. So we're going to talk about channels of communication. We'll talk about leaning into the culture of your organization. So these things will ultimately help you communicate more effectively with your business. It's also really important you understand the mechanisms in which your business communicates. So in this day and age, I mean, we all have notification fatigue of all the different systems that we have at our org. I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting hundreds of messages a day on a whole bunch of different mechanisms, and it's really hard to keep track of it. And that's just me. Think about your counterpart in these other groups that need to be able to do the things that we need them to, and think about all the different notifications that they get. Out of a raise of hands, do you guys get a lot of notifications during the day? And are you probably thinking about like what you have waiting for you? Yeah, a lot of heads are shaking. I see you, Joe. I know Joe gets a bunch. So you guys, like, you have to think of your counterparts and think about, oh man, you know what? If I'm getting bogged down in notifications, what's happening for them? And so think about that as you're working with them. Do you have a project management tool? Is that how you should communicate? Should it be Slack? Should it be email? How should official requests happen? Those mechanisms truly are important to how you're communicating. Are you using verbal or written techniques? Are you going to a meeting? Are you calling people up? Are you huddling on Slack? What are all the different ways that you communicate within your organization? And then consumability. You guys, I receive a lot of emails and I have no idea what that person is actually asking me to do. We send a lot of emails that ask another person to do something and they have no idea what to do. So when you are communicating, you need to communicate in a way that's consumable for the person that you need to take action. If they receive information and they don't know what to do with it, are they actually going to take action on the thing that you need them to do? Probably not. It's probably just going to sit in their email and then go down to the bottom of the list. So when you're sending out your communication, whatever it is, it needs to be in a way that is truly consumable. Here's the information, here's the ask, here's the due date, how can I support you? They need to know that. And if they don't, like I said, they're not going to act on the things that we need them to. So on the next two slides, we'll talk about channels of communication and leaning into the culture. Channels of communication. Recently, I did a fireside chat with this really lovely chief product officer. We did it as part of our diversity and tech group at Spring. And we targeted our engineering, product, data science, and security groups because a lot of the communication breakdowns were happening in these groups. And so this chief product officer, she brought this really great concept that I loved on different channels of communication. And so up here on the screen, you have these three different channels. You have upward, you have sideways, and you have down. And so when you are communicating up, that's your C-suite, it's your leaders, it's maybe your clients. They need to know the high-level information. They don't need to know in the weeds, this is what we're going to do, these are the modifications, here's the procedure. They don't need to know that. The second that you start giving them too much information, that is when we start asking more probing questions. You're trying to get down into the weeds, and that's not what you need from leadership. They need to know the status update and if there's a huge risk or something they need to take action on. Generally, you're providing them more of a status update. So you don't want to provide them in that weeds details. Now, when you're communicating more of sideways, those are your peers. Those are the people that are leading departments, they're leading groups, they're leading teams. And so they need to know the information to lead away from risk. What are the things that they're doing that may be risky in their areas, and how can they go about fixing it? Additionally, they need to know the information on things that we need them to implement. Say we are trying to go after ISO 27001 certification. My peers need to know what I need from their groups in order to be able to capacity plan appropriately. And they need to know that information in a reasonable time frame. Finally, we have downward communication. And this is communication for our individual contributors, our implementers, contractors, whoever is actually in the weeds. These are the people that are taking the information, they're consuming it, and actually applying it in the environment. And so they need to know all of the details. They need to know all of the information in order to be able to do their job effectively. And it's our job to make sure that they get this information in these channels, in these ways that is appropriate for them. So I ask you guys, when you go back to your organization, are you being mindful of your audience when you're communicating? Are you giving them the right information at the right time? And are you communicating well in advance for them to take the appropriate actions? If you can't say yes to any of that, you're likely having communication breakdowns at your organization, and it's making it challenging for your department to function, which then in turn makes it challenging for you to enable the business. So think about that while you're going forward and thinking of these challenges and things that you're trying to improve, and making sure that you understand these channels. And then additionally, make sure your team understands. It's not on me as a leader to only bear the burden of communication. It is on me as a leader to ensure that I've enabled my team to communicate effectively to do their job. And if they can't, then I'm giving them right training, I'm teaching them how to do it, and we are then enabling the business again. They're making sure the team has the right training. Culture. So we talked about the communications and the methods and the channels and the mechanisms and all those different things. Culture plays a really large part of your organization. If you have communication issues, breakdowns, whatever, it leads to your team being really frustrated. As much as I want to have a super stellar GRC program operating 100% of the time, that just doesn't happen. And the amount of times that I get my team frustrated over little things, it's because generally we're not being mindful of the culture at the organization. How does the culture operate at your org? Is it Slack? Is it Teams? Do they only use email? Or are they stuck in the Stone Ages where we call people up? Because I definitely don't like to call people up. How do you lean into that culture? And so I know at our organization, we love using Slack. And so if I need action to happen, I know I need to go to Slack. Just like my counterparts know if they need action from me, they're hitting me up in Slack. Yes, it causes tons of notifications, but again, I'm leaning into the culture and working with the culture on the best approach to them. If you're trying to go against the culture and force them into something that doesn't work, what you're gonna have is frustrations working with us. A lot of the times, people don't want to come to security. We're constantly in a state of making sure people are aware of us, making sure they know to contact us. And so if we're forcing a tool or a solution on them that goes against the culture, they're going to be even less inclined to talk to us. We're already a headache. Nobody wants to talk to us. They think when they talk to security, they're getting in trouble or they've done something wrong, and that's not what we want at all. We want to have really, really good relationships, and we do that by understanding how we communicate, leaning into the culture. Maybe the culture is we like 15-minute sync-ups on the things that we need to talk about. Lean into it and embrace it and plan for it within your own department. So before I wrap up communication, show of hands, how many of you guys feel like you're having communication issues at your organization now? Yeah, it's hard. Communication, double hands, I see you. The communication aspect really is hard, and I've spent a lot of my career working on how do I talk to the other people and how do I talk to them in a way that influences them to do the things that I need. We have so many different personalities that we have to work with, and if we're always in a state of conflict, it just makes the communication so challenging. So for all of you guys that have the communication issues, really mull over what's the best path and path of least resistance. How can I enable the business by having better communication? And I also ask you, once you identify what are your challenges with communication, jot it down and implement the things that you want to change. And 6 months from now, reevaluate. Did you get to where you were going with your communication? Were you able to make it better at the organization? Did you see increased productivity for these other teams? And if not, tweak it, right? We're in a constant state of improvement. So time over time, look over it, see how you can change it and adapt. All right, so advocating. When we partner with other teams, other business units, we almost get pushed into a state of bullying them to do the things that we need. So let's say we need to do system access reviews. I don't know about you guys, but system access reviews are super painful. We have issues with system owners even wanting to do them, right? It takes a lot out of their day. No one wants to take care of them. And so you're almost bullying them into doing it. I hate that approach. It creates tensions. It creates frustrations. So when you're thinking about the things that you need to do as an organization, how can you get to the point where you're advocating for these teams to have more bandwidth, have more time to be able to work on them? We shouldn't be in a state where we're bullying them to do these things. We should be advocating for them and helping. Maybe they can't do system access reviews because their team is at 150% capacity and they have not learned how to articulate that to leadership. I can sit down with my peer and say, hey, Joe, why are you not doing your system reviews? Like, what is going on? How can I help you? Well, maybe he tells me, I am working 80-hour weeks. I literally do not have time to do this. I can take that information back and work with leadership and help him figure out how do I solicit for more headcount to get these other things off my plate so I can actually do these other items. So now you start advocating for your peers, and they come to trust you, right? They don't see you as, oh, I'm compliant, so I'm coming to tell you to do things, but they see you as someone they can trust, someone that's going to support and advocate for them. Additionally, you need to align with their work. We know well ahead of time when things need to happen during the year. I know in November every year, I'm going to do a tabletop exercise. I know in January, I'm going to test from backups. I know in June, I'm going to get security training done, even though that's a terrible idea because everybody always goes on vacation during June. You know these things are happening, and we need to align to the business, right? The business has the ebb and flow of things that are going to happen. Should we be asking everybody to do security awareness during the summer when people are going on vacations, maybe they're traveling more because of work? No, we should be planning it for when the business is in and when the business generally has a lull. Should I be asking my organization to test from backups during January when that's when we have the most enrollments of patients? No, they need to focus on the things that are coming up from enrolling new patients. We need to align to their work. Slowly rotate our compliance activities around to when it best suits the business, and you'll run into less resistance. They'll be more inclined to help with these things because we've looked at their schedule and we've said, all right, we know the business is doing these things now, let's plan to do it later. And so now the business is more appreciative. They understand that we're actually looking out for their best interest and, again, not bullying them to do these things. And then the product and business roadmaps. So if you are working at a company that rolls out new product features all the time, you have to be mindful of that as well. That's going to influence the work alignment and the things that you need to get done. And more importantly, it's important that we understand that, because we need to get into the security of that particular pipeline, of those things that are happening. Are they rolling out a brand new feature that could possibly affect PHI or any other data that we're concerned about? So we integrate into there sooner, and then we start advocating for them. If we get integrated sooner and we see this risk pop up, let's say they're rolling it out in November and we find this risk in February, we can advocate for them to get more money, more budget, because we know the things that actually need to get fixed. So again, we're advocating for them and ensuring this work can actually happen. Training. So I do not mean security awareness training with this. This is training in order to enable the business. So understanding technologies. GRC should understand everything about our organization. We should know every system, every application. We should know what these do. We should know how the data flows through the organization, especially if you need to comply with GDPR, right? You have to do a data mapping exercise. So it's important that you understand how this happens in your org, because ultimately you need to be able to communicate with your business partners. You need to understand, well, is this really a risk when they're communicating this to me? And what's the risk scoring here? You can't do that if you don't understand the technologies. And so your GRC team needs training on understanding the technologies. And once you have that, you'll see that the communication, again, going back to like prong one there, the communication will get better, because the business, or maybe the SMEs in the product and engineering, actually see them trying to understand the technologies, and they're getting less frustrated with them and having to spend time telling them how the technology works, and they can have more of a collaborative conversation. On the flip side, the business should understand technologies that impact them. If I require everybody to go through the vendor review process for vendors that they're trying to onboard, they should understand that technology. It should be streamlined, it should be user-friendly, and if it's not, they're not going to want to do it. And you're going to have vendors that slip through the cracks, and you'll have vendors that you're sending data to because people didn't follow the process because it's not intuitive. So understand your technologies, both from the GRC side and what the business interfaces with. Decoding controls. Man, controls, they're sometimes really hard to understand what you need to do, right? You need your special decoder glasses, and if we need decoder glasses to figure out what these controls from these frameworks are telling us, there's no way the business is going to understand. So if your team cannot take a control and go explain it to an implementer, an individual contributor, the work is actually, it's not going to get done. And so your team needs to know, how do I explain this in a consumable way for the business to understand, and how can I communicate this control upwards to the C-suite so they understand the impact of this control. If you're not doing that, it's not going to get done. And so not only does the team need to be trained in how to communicate this, they also need to be trained in how they sit people down and talk to them. For this particular item, I actually spent a year contracting after I got out of the military, where I would take DISA-STIGs and sit down with system administrators and network engineers and explain to them what that DISA-STIG was trying to tell them to do. And they likely would have never gotten through those, because if anybody's worked with DISA-STIGs before, you know they're very long, they're very comprehensive, and you need your special decoder glasses to look at them. So I take that away and I apply it to my teams. What are the things they are really knowledgeable about, and what are the things that they're not? And how can I teach them to understand these controls better and communicate them to the people that actually need to implement them? And then effectiveness testing. So effectiveness of testing, it applies to both your GRC team and it applies to the business. So are you testing how effective your processes are? If you have a manual process, let's take vendor reviews again. If you have a vendor review process that's like 20 steps, Are you evaluating the effectiveness of it often? Probably not, because it's at 20 steps and it doesn't need to be. So figure out how you're evaluating your programs time over time and teach your teams how to evaluate the program, and then enable your teams to speak up when they think these are ineffective. Right? We need to allow our teams to have the safety, the psychological safety, in order to feel like they can speak up and say, we have ineffective programs happening. So you're teaching them how to evaluate the programs, you are defining the criteria for the effectiveness, and having them go forward and do the things. And then on the opposite side, you need to teach the business the same thing. They own a lot of the controls and the things that we need them to implement, and if they don't know how to evaluate it for its effectiveness, how are they going to improve it? They're just going to be stuck in a perpetual loop of just doing something for the sake of doing it without understanding, how can I make this more effective? So the effectiveness testing is super critical and actually ties into one of the bullets that I'm going to talk about next. So when we talk about enabling the business, the second bullet there talks about measurement and metrics. So tying in from effectiveness testing, you got to understand your measurement and metrics. That first bullet there is trust and transparency. So trust, it's really critical what we do in security, right? That's all we do: confidentiality, integrity, availability, trust. And if we are not building rapport with our business partners, if we are not enabling them, they're not trusting us, you're not going to have a good program operating. I know at this point in time, any of my peers can come to me, we can have a dialogue, and they trust that I am going to go do things to take care of their team. I'm going to help them take action, just like they can trust anybody from my team because they've built that rapport that we're going to go take action and help them. And then transparency. I don't believe in keeping secrets. I think my team should know all of the information. And so once I start enabling my team to have the same information that I have, they go forward, they understand the goals and objectives of what we're trying to do. I'm not trying to operate in a silo. I'm really trying to make sure that they know what they need to do for their job, and that comes with transparency. Additionally, when we talk about transparency, it's important that the business always understands what's going on. Security should not have the secret. Security should not be holding the keys to the kingdom of all the risk that we have. We should be communicating these things, again, well in advance. And so we create this trust and transparency loop that's happening where the business knows they can count on us. They know they can come to us. And we're creating transparency of how our program is operating. So trust and transparency. Highly recommend you take that concept and you ensure it's applied at your organization. Measurement and metrics. This is one of my favorite things. I get so giddy over doing some sort of analysis of how my program's operating. This is how I know for certain at my organization for my client questionnaires, it takes me 3 days to respond to 60 questions from a client. And it takes me 7 days if it's over 150 questions. I know for certain we have a 5-day turnaround for when the business asks us to review any sort of document. I know I have a 3-day turnaround for contracts, and it's because I've done the back-end data and analytics on it. That was the first thing I did when I started taking over this, because how are you going to improve if you don't understand the numbers? Right? There's certain things that you can improve because you witness it or you hear it, but there's other things you can't just make assumptions. You really do need the data and analytics behind it. So, highly recommend you look at your program. For every process that you have operating, have you defined out measurement and metrics criteria. So look at that and then improve over time. This is where you can get yourself into a continuous improvement cycle. That is really great thing that you can do for your organization. If you can get yourself into a continuous improvement cycle, you will improve year over year over year because you recognize that is a critical thing for your org. Additionally, when you do your metrics, you start to get an understanding of your maturity. Do you really just want to be doing the bare minimum and be a checkbox activity happening? Or do you want your program to be operating at the point that it's so effective that it's always enabling the business, and maybe it's even low touch because you've automated processes and you've done all the things that you've needed to? Automation. I love automation when it comes to GRC. There have been so many improvements in this space where you can take a vendor review almost through the entire cycle automated, and it's seriously great. If you guys have not evaluated that with your own organization, please take a look at it, because I promise you the return on investment from reduced overhead of employees managing these manual processes is well worth the time and effort to evaluate how can you automate. Leverage GRC tools if your budget allows. So if you're at an organization that you have a budget that will let you get a GRC tool, please look into it, because it really does help with how you're managing your program. There's a lot of functionality built into there for the metrics. So take a look at that. Technical expectations ahead of time. My engineering and product team should always know my expectations when they are trying to roll out something new. Nothing should ever be a surprise to them, and we do that by having guardrails. What are the things that you can do that don't go outside of my guardrails? They should have this information, and you should be training them, because what then happens is a reduction in them having to have one-off conversations with you. They feel more comfortable and confident in the things that they need to do. But you have to give that to them in the first place. And if you are not in a place where you can give that, you're automatically blocking the business from being effective. So you really do need to understand the guardrails and how they apply to your organization. And then additionally, building security into the CI/CD pipelines. Is there a way you can codify the things that you need for them within the entire life cycle and have it implemented? If possible, please, please, please take that avenue and make sure people understand it, because now you are really enabling the business. You're not a blocker all the time, right? The theme of this talk is how we enable the business, how we get them to work better, harder, stronger, and still do the security things that we need them to do. Okay, so we got through the entire Swiss Army knife. There's tons of prongs in there. I talked about a lot of different concepts, a lot of them geared around communication. So take that away, guys. Communication, super critical. Building relationships. I spend so much of my time building relationships, and you know what? I love it. I love getting to know my peers. I love getting to know the people in the organization, because it allows me to help them. I want to make sure that they're doing the things that I need them to do, and sometimes they need a listening ear. Sometimes they need someone in their corner, and I can do that by listening to them and building relationships. And then eventually they come to trust me, and when I need them for something, they help me. And it really is for the best intentions for the organization to make sure that you really have those relationships built. Automate where possible. Automation is your friend. I'm serious, you're gonna reduce so much overhead once you figure out how to automate processes, and now your team can focus on building relationships, doing training, doing this, other things, instead of spending hours over hours answering a questionnaire or reviewing a vendor when it could otherwise be an automated process. Choose simplicity over complexity. One of the things that makes it so challenging to work with GRC is we have so many things that people have to talk to us about, and we seem so clunky. You have to do steps A, B, C, D, F, all whatever, and we seem so clunky, and it's because our processes generally are complex. And so figure out how you can simplify and meet the things that you need to do, because the business, they will love it. If it's easy for them to do, they're going to be more inclined to do it. Use the right communication channel. So understand these different communication channels, how they apply to your org, and then integrate into the sales pipeline. I only touched on client questionnaires just a little bit, but it's super critical. If you are an organization, which you likely are, that have tons of client questionnaires come in, understand your own sales lifecycle at your organization. How do you partner with sales to get ahead of it? If you work in compliance, or if you're in my position, you tend to read a lot of contracts, DSAs, other things like that for the security aspect, but you also have questionnaires. So get in that sales pipeline ahead of time, because it does create undue burden to the team to have these random questionnaires pop up through the week, and then you have to load balance appropriately. So get into the sales pipeline and understand how you can leverage that to your benefit. If you know you're going to have a bunch of questionnaires come in August, well, maybe you shouldn't be planning any major compliance activities then, and your team needs to be load balanced to plan for these questionnaires. So we've reached the end. I think I saved enough time, Kat, for a couple of questions if people have some. So you guys can contact me through any of these ways: email, Twitter, LinkedIn. Best chance of reaching me really is LinkedIn. Don't check Twitter too often, and Gmail, I check it probably like once a day. So yeah, it's GRC as a Swiss Army knife. I hope you guys had some takeaways that you can actually apply at your organization. And if you guys have questions, I'm here for a couple more minutes. Thanks.